And joining us today from England is Mark Walsh, an embodiment coach. How you doing, Mark?
I'm all right. I've got a bit of that December end of the year running out of shits to give. But it's been a pretty good year, so I can't complain.
Yeah. How's the weather?
Yeah.
Is that helping?
It's a very English start to a podcast, but it's a bit grey. I was just in Texas teaching, and that was much nicer. Texas in November, Austin in November is pretty nice. So I've had a bit of a serotonin top up from Texas, and
Nice.
now I'm suffering England until I go for Christmas in Italy with my girlfriend.
Oh, where are you going?
Lake Como. She lives
Ah.
a tourist attraction, essentially. You know, people proposing on one knee and Instagrammers, and she's one street away from this sort of fantastic natural beauty. So it's a nice place to hang out.
Yeah, it's not far from me, actually. Like 3 hours drive. Go down there often, down to Lugano. But anyway, digression. We don't want to digress too much. We've got limited time today. So what were you doing in Austin? What were you teaching?
So I teach embodiment coaches. What the hell's that? My mum says every Christmas dinner. So coaching, people probably know the field of people ask you questions. They try and improve your life. They're trying to help your marriage or your business or whatever. Lots of different ways to do that. A lot of them are purely verbal or cognitive. And the way we teach people, I teach coaches, is how to work with the body with that. So that might be helping people change state, get a different perspective. The body just shifts things very quickly. Working with simple things, nothing too athletic. So it's movement and breath, posture, simple things like that. I've done that in the business world. I've done that in areas of conflict, in war zones, working around trauma, which obviously intersects with embodiment. And train a lot of coaches. So that's my job. I've been doing that for, I just realized the other day, actually, that I started when I was 18 doing this kind of work, and I'm 45 now. So a little while.
So how did you get into this when you were 18? That sounds like a story.
Yeah, I mean, my story in some ways is the story of Western civilization's most critical problem. So it's a microcosm for a big, if that doesn't sound too pretentious, a more philosophical kind of microcosm of a macrocosm, that I was cognitively very smart. So Western culture is sort of very, it's intellectual, it's logical. We're good at that as a culture. I was as an individual, but that actually didn't make me happy. I was miserable. I was suicidal. I was alcoholic by the time I was a teenager. And a lot of mental illness in my family, alcoholism, other things. And when I went to university to study psychology, I kind of had an intuition that the answers I was looking for weren't in the library, because I'd read the whole library at sixth form. For American listeners, it's like high school, right? So I'd literally read every book in the Cambridge sixth form I went to. And I went, you know what, there's got to be another way of learning about being human. And you're in the army, so you know about character training, and this is something that in certain pockets of society still sort of exists, but generally we don't think of that in mainstream Western society, sort of training the person. We just think about learning about things. And it's like, you live on a ski resort, right? It's like learning about skiing is very different from learning to ski. And I felt like I'd learned a lot about life, but I hadn't learned how to be a human. And the martial arts was the opening for me. I studied traditional Aikido for many years, and then realized that, I could combine that with the psychology. And that led me into the field of sort of coaching, leadership development, other areas, and combining the Aikido with meditation, different practices. And that's led me all over the world. I've taught all over the world and been involved in, projects, everything from corporate boardrooms to bomb shelters in Ukraine. So it's been a wild ride the last 25 years, 27 years.
All right. So I've talked about this before, but I may be interested to hear what you're going to say about this, but I'll give you just a very quick one about how I felt when I was in my mid-teens, early teens, mid-teens, whatever, about how I was, and my life was, there was nothing wrong with, the life was, it wasn't like I was hard up or anything like that. It was all fine. But yeah, I didn't really see the point of school. I wasn't really enjoying it. I could pass exams with maybe a day or two and get good enough grades to get into university, and I went to university, which was a huge mistake. And I was even more miserable. But I always just never felt that this is for me. It wasn't my calling. And I love learning. I used to sneak books out of the library in the bookshelves next to my desk and read books under my desk while the teacher was talking on about something or other. And I didn't and I've always learned. I love learning. I guess that's one of the reasons I do a podcast. But it's all feel like I was searching for something else. And it sounds, when you said that, it kind of hit me, resonated quite hard there. So how was it for you when you were, I guess, in your mid-teens, like 15, 16 sort of age?
Well, I was absolutely miserable. I mean, one of the features of ADHD, which I have, is that we tend to only be interested in things a lot or not at all. And I think that magnifies a problem with our culture more generally. Sometimes it's described as the meaning crisis. Our culture has lost its way. Our culture doesn't have a way to be good. It doesn't have a sense of purpose for people in the culture. I mean, this is, if we go really philosophically, this is a problem with materialism and modernity, is that we live in a culture that says only the physical is real. There's no spirituality to life. There's no depth. There's no meaning. Just accumulate as much stuff before you die, and that's life. You know, maybe have some hedonism if you to cope with it. And it turns out that hedonism isn't really a good enough medicine for the ills of life. And also you get diminishing returns with it. As someone who's been a drug addict, for example, you know, like I've run that experiment with everything from Stella Artois to Russian girls. And I regret nothing. But the experiment was definitely worth, if you're a young man listening to this, do run the experiment. Be careful, but do run the experiment. But the results of that experiment I found were nihilism, depression, more addiction. And I would say that's the experiment our civilization's been running since the sort of 18th or 19th century, some would say earlier. And now I see that it's hitting a critical mass where people are very cut off from themselves, very cut off from each other, and very cut off from, we could say, meaning or higher purpose, higher power. And those things are connected, the lack of community, the lack of embodiment, and the lack of meaning. So I've really given my career to helping people reconnect to those things.
Well, that's super interesting that you mentioned you had ADHD, because there was something on social media the other day that flashed up, and it was a questionnaire. I think it was on X, and it was 5 questions. Do you have ADHD? And I went, oh my God. I suppose that I have ADHD, because if I don't find it interesting, I want nothing to do with it.
Yeah.
At all. And if I find it interesting, it's
hyper focused or not focused at all. They tend to be. I mean, there's an overdiagnosis issue happening. Like, everyone's got ADHD and autism and God knows what else now. But my niece got diagnosed, and I actually went with her to sort of keep her company. And then she was like, Uncle Mark, you've got all these things too. And I was like, oh, yeah. And then they started asking me questions like, did you have problems sitting still at school? Do you have problems focusing on things that aren't interesting? And I was like, oh, yeah. And in some ways, it's a superpower. But, I employ Germans. That's the solution. If you do have ADHD, you need Germans to look after you. I have a German PA and German course manager on our main coaching course. And, that keeps me in line. And then I just get to be creative and wild and make funny jokes and have a good time.
Well, I've got a Swedish wife.
Excellent. They're excellent. Good
fairly
taste.
Teutonic, I would say. Yeah. Yeah, that was my thing. You do like Russian girls, Swedish girls for me it was, but that came much later, shall we say. But also I would, you mentioned the nihilistic aspect of it, of basically dulling your senses with alcohol and drugs, because there's that lack of connection, there's that lack of meaning in your life. Which I see, and it's still a thing. It's a difficult habit to get out of. And I understand it very well, shall we say. And what I'm trying to figure out is, if you can break that connection, I see a lot of people who suffer the same way, but it's gone on much later in their lives, So one of the reasons I joined the army, to be honest, was I needed to get away from that life.
Yeah, bit of structure and discipline, martial arts for me. Yeah.
Well, yeah, and basically to go and do something different that I had to really, really test myself at, and it was a very hard test for me. But what is there a way to break that cycle?
This is a big question. So there's definitely things on an individual level you can do. So, 12-step recovery can be very useful for many people. I've used that myself. Meditation is certainly useful. Developing discipline, whether that be through the army or martial arts or, through cold showers or whatever someone's practice is, can be very very helpful. I think in terms of finding meaning, that's a bigger question for all of society, but we can find our own personal meaning within that. And certainly getting in the body helps, because I think of the body as one's radar for meaning, because it tells us what lights us up, what gives us that feeling of energy and enthusiasm. And, hey, this is something I should be doing more of. I should be following this. And then we could add to that community, the importance of being around other people who are doing meaningful things, who are, regulating in more healthy ways than drugs and alcohol, for example. Then the bigger systems, we could also mention nature. I know you like being outdoors. I do too. And nature connection is a part of my day every day. And that also helps me connect to something bigger than myself. And if nothing else, it just helps me, calm down from someone that tends to be a bit stressed and hyperactive otherwise.
But when talking about meaning, did you have something that happened to you, apart from you talked about your martial arts, but did you have something that happened to you which gave you meaning? As in, did you have some sort of insight or an awakening or an experience that you could actually see the other side, having gone through what you've done, what you had as a teenager?
Yeah, there's a few. So I'll say some positives and some negative ones as well. So when I was 13, my cousin, who I was raised with, I was very close to, killed himself. And that made me go, oh shit, maybe life's not worth living. So I think that really was a sort of a sharp shot. Equally, I used to watch my dad having quite bad epileptic fits, and I started to realize, like, oh, there's a whole different states of consciousness are a thing. I used to see my dad drunk. I used to see him having epileptic fits. I used to see him as a normal, nice dad and go, wow, states of consciousness are really things, When I was a teenager, I had my first sexual experiences, and I actually had a sort of mystical opening in those experiences. I would sort of, real flashing white light, oneness with the love of the universe kind of stuff. And I just thought that's what sex was at first, but I was like, this is amazing, with the enthusiasm of a 16-year-old boy who just got laid. But it was more than that. I actually had a sense that the body is a potential gateway to something much more profound. And then the martial arts, it was just like, wow, you can actually calm yourself down. You can regulate yourself. I'd say that now. I now see that as nervous system regulation, for example. I didn't have that language at the time. So they were some of the experiences. I guess one more a bit later in life was I got involved in a peace project in Cyprus with the United Nations that was using Aikido with different groups that are in conflict, like Israelis and Palestinians, and Americans and Iraqis and different groups. And I had a very profound feeling of rightness when I got involved in that project. And then a sense of like right place, right time, but like profoundly like square peg, square hole. And, as opposed to most of my life, which felt like round peg, square hole. So that feeling of rightness. And then I just followed that. I actually went and trained with a lot of the people I met on that project, different teachers, trauma workers, leadership trainers, because I felt, okay, this feels profoundly more interesting and more comfortable in the deepest sense of the word than anything else I'd done. In the same way as when one falls in love, one might feel more comfortable in a profound way. And yeah, those experiences, both the negative and the positive, I would say, opened me up to meaning. And I wouldn't say there was one sort of necessarily sort of moment before and after, but it was there is a possibility of entering through the body into these experiences.
So that was pretty much the third thing. You got your drugs, you got your alcohol, and you got your sex, which are three ways of altering your state of mind, altering your consciousness. They're very powerful. All three of them are very powerful.
Martial arts, skiing, snowboarding. When I was young, I used to have very strong flow states on the ski slopes, really enter into sort of states of flow where there's timeless kind of cascading opening of the present moment. There's all sorts of ways possible. And I think a question becomes cost-benefit analysis. I've seen people waste their lives on the ski slopes. I've seen people waste their life on drugs. I've seen people have very, ruined marriages on the ski slopes and ruin marriages by becoming addicted to tango or aikido or whatever the thing is. So I think there's always a cost-benefit analysis, whether, psychedelics, which I've been taking since I was a child, not continuously, I should say, but, occasionally. So I think there's always a cost benefit analysis. Breath work for some people. Do these things give more than they take? And that is the question you need to be very honest about, because once they start taking more than they give, it's time to, at the very least, switch it up a bit.
Yeah, we'll come on to that later. I've got that on my list of things I wanted to talk about. So using your body as a portal to different experiences. Would you even say it to enlightenment or a higher consciousness?
I feel like a knobhead when I start talking about those subjects.
Me too.
And I think that you need to be careful with your sense of self-inflation, my sense of self-inflation. Also, they can be used more or less rigorously. So I've got Buddhist friends, for example, who would use states these terminology very rigorously. And they'd say, well, which kind of enlightenment? Is it state or trait? And which of the factors of enlightenment led to that? And there's 4 stages in classical Theravadan enlightenment. They would talk about those kind of things. When I'm training people, I'm often talking more in terms of skill sets. So that to me is sort of very down to earth language. It's like, okay, self-regulation is a skill. That's something we can get better or worse at. So states are fun, but states come and go. You take the ayahuasca, you go on the ski slope, you do the breath work, you have an altered state, which could be very useful for insight, for opening a possibility or some sense into how life is. But that doesn't last. And I think we've both seen people who are trying to make it last in different ways. They're trying to make the drug high last forever or the ski high last forever. And that doesn't end well in my experience. Better to build skills that you can actually use in your life.
Because I've done a lot of podcasts with people who are very impressive human beings who have done pretty crazy stuff that you really have to wrap your head around how they get into the mental state to be able to do that, just because of the fact that it's just so out there. So endurance running, skiers, snowboarders who are still pushing the envelope to this day. And one of the interesting facts about, or the traits about this, is what they will set themselves a task, and that task will be to climb that mountain and then ski down the other side, something along those lines, or run 300 miles in 5 days, or whatever it is they have to do. And they finish it, and then they feel no fulfillment.
Yeah.
That's the job's done. What's my next challenge? And it's like they're always chasing after something else. What's that?
The satisfaction is never in completing things. I mean, our reward system is designed by evolution to make us continuously dissatisfied. A satisfied animal is not breeding or feeding, right? So the reward system is there to move us towards a goal. I think John Pearson talks about this. There's neuroscientists that talk about how dopamine works, for example. And it's either, what's the nature of that goal? This is how computer games are designed to addict young people, for example. There's a feeling of moving towards a goal. It's just completely irrelevant to the rest of life and society. I am not impressed by these extreme sports people. Most of them, for me, just remind me of me as a drug addict. David Goggins, I think, is highly traumatized.
Yeah.
Many of them are just running trauma hyperarousal. They're constantly running from a dad who used to hit them. They are drug addicts, but they're just internally creating their drugs rather than exogenously taking them. I mean, it just seems like a lot of trouble. If you want to be a drug addict, stay home and smoke crack. I mean, you don't need to go to the Himalayas.
That's a good point. Yeah. And it is. It's all about the journey. And that's I guess the disappointing realization was that when you set yourself a goal and you complete it, you expect you're going to get this big high.
It's a big letdown usually, right?
It's a bit of
a feeling of, I did the biggest Zoom event in the world. We did an embodiment conference, 500,000 people, 1,000 speakers, huge event, biggest thing I've ever done online. And it was, 6 months, a year run up, a lot of financial risk. And it was fantastic in the run up and the doing it. And then the day after, I was with the team and we kind of said, right, stay on a day, we'll celebrate, we'll go for a meal together the day after this sort of 10-day event. And it was just such a flat feeling of, and then it's, well, what's next? Right? So do you want to live your life in that? I mean, I think there's a profundity to normal life. There's a profundity to the kind of just present moment doing normal things. rather than seeking excitement. And part of the problem is the internet, because the internet magnifies the voices of those who have done the most extreme things. So if you go to YouTube, it's it's clickbait, right? And I know I've done a few extreme things myself, but I don't think that defines that a person has wisdom. And this move towards the extremes is encouraged by the algorithm, as it were. And people want more and more extreme heroes and more examples. And like body image, for example, like, the Mr. Olympia now compared to Mr. Olympia in 1950. Mr. Olympia in 1950 is achievable. Mr. Olympia now is just something ridiculous without a huge ton of drugs, And that's just a physical example. There's these psychologically, used to run a marathon and people were impressed. Now, if you haven't done 5 marathons in the desert naked, it's nothing. So I'm not sure how healthy this trend is.
So I guess, what are your view then is that you have to set yourself not targets. Well, I'm putting words in your mouth, but that the end is not the goal. It's a continuous process of improvement. Am I getting that right?
No.
Good.
Yeah, I mean,
that didn't make sense to me.
That's a healthier way of looking at it in some ways. One way of looking at it is simply like an Aristotelian model of virtue. How do I establish virtue? I think that's interesting. Another way of looking at it is, I want to encourage flow states in my life because flow is wonderful, but, not at the cost of meaning more generally. So I'm not just doing hedonism by other means, that there's some sense of meaning making, significant contribution to the world, and that doesn't have to be contributing to others, not just chasing state, right? So I've interviewed experts on flow states, for example, and they spend their whole life surfing or snowboarding, and it always just struck me as like, but what are you doing for the world? That there's just hedonism by other means. Other people, it's psychedelics. So I mean, that's my take on it, but I'm not sure if I'm answering your question or not.
Yeah, we'll probably cover that as we go through. So let's go back to what we were supposed to talk about in the first place: embodiment. How do you get out of your body, Mark? That's something I'm interested in.
Yeah, I wouldn't recommend it. I mean, getting out of your body has profound consequences for your health, for your levels of empathy, for your sense of connection. I mean, there are people that do mystical journeying and things like that. That's part of certain indigenous traditions, but that's certainly not the norm. That's certainly not how I'd recommend spending most of your time. I mean, how do you get out of your body? You live in modernity. You live in the industrialized, mechanized, dehumanized, technologically obsessed modern world. That's how you get out of your body.
Yeah. I read a book, Robert Monroe. Have you heard of him?
I don't know.
The Monroe Institute, but he's one of the first astral travelers, astral projectors rather. And that's a fascinating book, to the point that when I finished it, it tells you how to do it.
Yeah.
And I was lying on my bed and I had an audio book, and I was lying there and I'd following the steps, do this, do the breathing, calm yourself down. And then I just stopped and said, well, what are you doing? You can't just, you've got a wife and kids. You can't just start zooming off across the universe. So the point what I was trying to say there is, what actually are you doing by getting out of your body? So when it comes to the embodiment aspect, what are you looking at there?
Get in your body, spending more time in your body more deeply. Why might you want to do that? I mean, well, there's a whole bunch, right? What is just basic well-being? Are you actually listening to your signals about whether you need rest or whether you're hungry? I just had lunch, right? It's like, am I overeating? Am I eating food that's really nourishing me? Simple things. It doesn't have to be, in the alternative space, there's this obsession with magic powers. I just think it's really childish. It's like, try being a decent human being before, my goal today is not to be an asshole boss. My goal is to keep being healthy, to get through my holiday, to be a good boyfriend to my girlfriend, simple stuff. This is the magic powers, not astral traveling or altered states. I've done all the altered state stuff, and it's great occasionally as a useful reminder of, there's something more. But yeah, for me, spending time in your body, being in your body, going against the trend of sort of dehumanizing industrialization, I think that's well worth doing if you want to be happy and healthy and be in connection with people around you. These are meaningful things to me.
So the dehumanization aspect. So how do you how do you bring people out of that dehumanization?
Yeah, I think you need regular practices of embodiment. For some people, that's just going outside and feeling the wind on their face and the sun on their skin, spending time sitting by the river here in Frome. For other people, it's a more formal practice like yoga, body-based meditation. I highly recommend for all my students as a sort of anchoring point. Are you, dancing? Are you with other people? Are you in community with other people who are in their bodies? And also it's a framework. It's, I'm going to treat myself as a human being, not a human doing. I'm going to treat myself as an organic, chaotic creature and not as a machine to be optimized. And that perspective will lead to different choices.
Yeah, geez. So what you're just saying is you're basically living in the moment.
I'd say mindfulness is part of it. It's not all of it. In fact, sometimes I don't want to live in the moment. I'm planning the future like a normal human. But certainly that present moment anchor is often helpful. And a mindfulness is a good base for many of us. It's not the whole picture. It's not everything there is, but it seems to have a positive effect on people's physical and mental health for starters.
Mm. What is it about being in nature then that brings you back into the present?
A few things. I've been thinking about this, and there's books written on this. There's people who are eco-psychologists who are real specialists. Some of them I've had on my podcast, for example. I think one of it is just sensorial richness. So right now I'm sitting in a temperature-controlled room. There's no wind, there's no sun. It's all very consistent. And the way nerves work is consistent input is ignored. So it's actually change and stimulus. So like my skin, I can't really feel it, but if I touch my skin, I can because it changes the input. Yeah. So some of it's sensorial richness. Some of it, as I think we're probably wired by evolution to have a sort of down-regulatory quality, particularly to things like bird song, the sound of water, green, it's why houseplants are relaxing even in your house. So we have a sort of evolutionary wiring towards a certain down-regulation, i.e. if you're in the desert and there's no plants and no water, you probably should be anxious. So on some level, if you're in a sort of office space with none of that, your mind is going, this is a dangerous environment on some level. And thirdly, I think there is a sort of mystical aspect to the natural world. There's been, mystics and people who have wanted to connect to something bigger often go off into the forest or go off into the desert. They go off into the natural world in some way. So I think there's a few levels of it, but people have written whole books on this topic.
Bizarrely enough, I actually quite like being in the desert, and it makes me quite, I don't know, introspective.
Yeah, fact, it has an effect, right? It's psychoactive.
Yeah, I had a real yearning because when we were out, we were in Jordan, in the middle of the desert, and set up a camp, and we were there for weeks. And the Bedouin guys were going back and forth, and you could see them in the distance. They stayed away from us. They didn't get too close, but you'd see the camel trains, and I think they were probably running guns from the coast, from Lebanon or from Jordan through into Iraq. I'm guessing smuggling anyway. But I could see them. They were camped up, and they weren't that far away. And I had this really strong urge to just, forget all this and just go and become a desert nomad. I'd read T.S. Eliot. I'd read, was it the Pillars of Wisdom? Is that 4 Pillars? Whatever the book's called, something about the Pillars of Wisdom. I'm blanking on it at the moment. But it was such a strong sense to the point that I borrowed the commanding officer's motorcycle, and I was going to ride up and have a chat with him, even though I don't speak virtually no Arabic, just to go and have a chat and see what my chances were of joining them and heading off and becoming a smuggler in the desert. Something about it, though, isn't there?
Yeah, I mean, there's a couple of things. One is the desert has always been a place of altered states, right? Jesus wanders off in the desert, so there's that. But then I think we're over-civilized, and modern man, particularly, those who were maybe drawn to the army and adventure and martial arts, things like that particularly, I'll say us, because I think we both have that urge. We probably feel over-constrained by modernity, that there's rules for everything. The romantic sort of Lawrence of Arabia idea or run away with the Native Americans, there's that idea is appealing. I think the reality might be less pleasant and enjoyable, but the idea of shaking off the shackles of civilization and the council tax and the rules and all the, those things becoming a pirate or a smuggler or something like that, that certainly appeals. I can see why a masculine person in a modern context might find that appealing.
Is that what it is? Do you reckon
I'm not sure for you,
it's in our DNA? I mean, for me, I feel that strong. I like to try and get into nature every day, even if I just go and sit in the woods for a couple hours, just quietly sitting there, hidden away. No one can see me. It's quiet, and I'm just listening to the birds and looking up at the sun through the trees, through the leaves.
It's our ancestry, right? I mean, all our ancestors were spending time in the forest and in nature and nomadically doing their thing. So, I mean, it must be wired, and it's to some extent.
Yeah, it has to be, right? It absolutely has to be. There's a book, you mentioned it there, just running away and joining the Native Americans, called Tribe by Sebastian Junger. Have you read that one?
Yeah, I haven't read that book, but I'm aware of him more generally.
First chapter is brilliant. It talks about the early colonists and coming from Europe, where there was a very rigid caste structure. I suppose a class system is probably the better word to use. Even down to what you could and couldn't wear. You couldn't wear certain colors depending on your status. And what they were having a big problem because the settlers moving westward were encountering the Native American tribes and saying, well, you guys, there's no real rank system. You got your chief, but it's an egalitarian system. And, everyone works for each other and they live a good life and they're all looking very healthy. And so what turned out, it was actually a problem for the government because there were so many people, white Europeans, going to join the Native American Indians, to the point that, and when they went and found them and tried to get them to come back, they wouldn't even come back.
There were certainly a few cases that, I'd suspect a lot of that is liberal romanticization of indigenous people, which is very common amongst those of us who feel over-constrained. Is a sort of, it's Rousseau, it's like this return to original goodness. I mean, Native American tribes, for example, were notorious for torturing each other to death over days and days. So let's not cannibalism, Aztec sacrifices, let's not idealize Native people. I think there was some absolute advances. The sort of shitting on European culture is also quite common amongst our intelligentsia class. We have essentially a traitorous intelligentsia who dislike the intelligentsia of the West, hate the West. And, essentially they're traitors and they're communists. So, as a result, anything that seems anti-Western, people joining the Native... No, mostly what happened between the Native Americans and the settlers was war, which the Western people won because they had better guns. Yeah, that's mostly what happened.
But there is an aspect to it, is if you're at the bottom end of the social ladder and you have an opportunity to go and not have to worry about money, not have to worry about looking after yourself, feeding yourself, I get it must be a draw.
It wasn't a communist utopia, right? They still had tribal chieftains. They still had hierarchy. They had rigid gender roles. I mean, this isn't some sort of utopian vision of equality.
But as it was back then, you've got. It must have been a rough life as a settler.
I'm sure it was tough. I mean, life was tough for everyone back then, right? I mean, I wouldn't want to live before iPhones and cappuccinos and modern healthcare.
Yeah. So, I don't know. I mean, there is that draw, right? I'm not knocking
the draw of the wild has always been there because we feel we're in a cage. I mean, people today aren't even breeding. We're below replacement birth rates across the West and across Southeast Asia as well. We're like animals in a zoo that won't fuck. Like we've stopped breeding. Well, that's how disconnected from the life we are.
Well, there is that is a huge problem. Britain is particularly bad. I mean, it's the same across Europe. But it's because it's so expensive. And I think it's down to taxation.
Economics are one factor, but people always had babies when they were poor. That's not the only factor. My grandparents in Ireland had 5 kids and they were dirt poor. So economics is a factor that people can't buy a house, for example.
It's a very interesting point.
But it's not a major factor. I've lived in poor African communities where people were a lot poorer and they had 7 kids. So while economics is not nothing, it's great if you can buy a house and move out from your parents. That's the thing. Most of it's, I'd say, a spiritual malaise. Most of it's a non-belief in the culture. We've lost our belief in our own culture. This is typical of decadent societies generally. Like the Romans had a birth rate collapse. Various other cultures throughout history have had birth rate collapses when they move into decadence and they lose their spirituality. And if you think about it just from a materialist philosophical point of view, why would you have babies? I mean, it's just a like, hey, this is going to get in the way of my drugs and partying. I want to keep being on Tinder and having sex with 5 different people. I can't have babies. Like this is having children is the ultimate sacrifice and the ultimate sense there's more than my tribe that I want to contribute to my tribe and I want something to survive me. What matters is the continuity of the group, not this hyper individual. What matters is my own pleasure. I mean, nobody has children for their own pleasure. It's in some ways very illogical to have children if you're a hedonist.
But in the previous generations, you mentioned your Irish grandparents with the 5 kids. Same
Yeah,
to my
yeah.
family, same thing. But at the time, no one was really rich. Do you know what I mean? It wasn't like you don't see it now. People not driving around in Ferraris, but people weren't going away. Like my parents live in Cyprus.
Yeah.
I've got a brother living in Australia, in Scotland. People are all over the place, cousins and all over the world, really. And whereas before you lived in the same place, and you lived in the same village or same town, and you had that, and your grandparents, they had children very young. So what we classify as very young now, which would probably we would
the
back
age
then
we're
was
designed
called
to have children.
the age you're designed to have children, the optimum age designed to have children. And so there was a support network. Even if you were poor, you had to go out and work. You maybe pop them off to the grannies or the great grandmother who wouldn't have been that old now.
Sisters,
in
brothers.
comparison.
So look, the support rather than money being the key thing, support network is one. So we're so immature. Our culture doesn't force anyone to grow up. So as a result, we stay children forever. And children are great consumers and they're great placid members of a system. They're great placid. Governments love adult children, on benefits or being told what to do. Children just do what they're told. And consumer culture loves children who are just eating lollipops of various types, rather than adults who grow up and who go, there is that idea of the support network. But again, consumer culture, this is the left wing in me, says we just move people around to wherever's suitable for consumerism, wherever the factory needs workers. So that destroys the village, they call it. The idea of the village, not just necessarily a village, but the idea of a network of support. And you still see that in Southern Europe. I was on a working class council estate in Mallorca, one of the Spanish islands, away from the tourist areas. And you saw the community and the connections, the intergenerational support. And the mother would give her baby to her sister or mother and go dancing with her husband, and all the guys around the football, and you see the different generations connecting. That's normal for humans. Western isolated families, and add feminism to that, so the women are working. So they, not only do they not have support from family, they don't even have their own support. So that's an insane proposition for human beings. Of course, we're all going mad at record levels.
Well, it brings it back to what you were saying before about this lack of meaning. And I think for me, certainly, and I think probably for my wife too, she wasn't really that keen. I mean, she's a working professional, successful and all that kind of thing. And, I hadn't really thought about having kids until she met me. I don't know the tamed savage, I suppose you'd call it. And I managed to persuade her into having kids. But for me, it's given me a great deal of meaning for my life.
For almost everyone I speak to with kids say this is one of the biggest sources of meaning.
And it gives you a great deal of meaning. And, going back to what you were saying before about infantilization, and we just got adult kids, is I retrospectively looking back, and I might be looking, I don't really know. It was so long ago, but I felt very uncomfortable in society because I felt like you were being conditioned into doing stuff that you just sit down, shut up, learn this, you'll get a good job, and then you'll retire and you can go and play golf. And that never appealed to me. And, people are saying you go to university, get a degree in engineering or law or something, and then you'll always have a job. And I thought, I can't sit and read books, like law books all day. That would destroy me. And it was like my spiritual revolt. I had inside me, I couldn't do it. And
I
I've
couldn't
been
either.
bouncing
I'm
it.
with you 100%. I was told to get
Yeah,
an office job after university. I went to the careers fair. I left in tears. I went, I can't do this. There's
yeah,
no way I can do this. And I
similar.
luckily sort of had the balls, or maybe just the ADHD, to really pursue things that were meaningful to me. It took me 7 or 8 years after uni to find what I loved. And those wilderness years were tough, to not know what I was doing and not have the money, right?
Mm.
So
Yeah,
money's not a great substitute for meaning.
I know, and it's being skint. Skint being broke, for those listening abroad, having no money and having no direction, and I was working in bars and restaurants trying to maintain my hedonistic lifestyle, and it was horrible. And that I think was probably the low point. It was the low point of my life, so far. Let's not get ahead of ourselves. And I found, because something else might happen. You never know. So what I'm trying to say is the conditioning is extremely strong, and I think I absolutely 100% agree with you when it comes to it's conditioned to be a workforce, and the whole aspect of, like, for instance, I used to have to go to Sunday school, kicking and screaming. You you get the crib notes, the 10 Commandments. Okay, right, that I can probably adhere to most of them most of the time, and that's me done. But that's what I learned. But I guess it was even an active community, just everyone going to the church, kids and little boys like myself not wanting to be there. But you kind of, once you're there, you kind of have a good time because your pals are there. But there's a lack of community and the bonds of close bonds that you get outside friendship, so with your family and things like that. So it's just the whole conditioning of society is, I think, 100% wrong, and I think we're doing it wrong by forcing people to do stuff they don't want to do, just so they can live and eat. So I'm starting to sound like you say, one of them damn commies, but I'm not at all.
Well,
Listen,
there's truth in the right and there's truth in the left, right? The right says, hey, we need to have a tribe, we need to have a place. So the traditional right has always been strong on place and tribe and a sense of spiritual meaning. The left totally lacks that. So a traditionalist culture, and this, I don't mean the 1950s, I mean the Middle Ages, had a hierarchy that was meaningful to everyone, with spirituality at the core. So that's the sort of the right at its best, is those things: spirituality, people, place. And I think those can be taken too far. Hashtag World War II, hashtag World War One. But those
hashtag
things,
World War III.
Yeah, maybe. But those things are still meaningful concepts. And what the left gets right is some sense of like, hey, people shouldn't be forced just to do stuff to survive, that there's, it's necessary for people to have human dignity, and that, we should be careful that hierarchies aren't oppressive. That also makes sense to me. There's some basic spiritual equality between people. The left does that right. So I think integrating these different worldviews, but essentially, Nietzsche talked about this. We're not talking about anything new. Like, as soon as modernity came into being and said that what there is materialism and there isn't anything else, then the glue that holds society together started coming apart. And, I just spent the weekend traveling around the UK to see various parts of my family, to exchange Christmas presents with my Italian girlfriend. And honestly, what I saw around the UK was absolute decay. 40-year-old football fans, drunk, acting like babies, youth who are absolutely lost, people, consumer culture at its worst, mass migration with people who are absolutely not invested in the country. It's just an economically convenient place to live. A complete collapse in the society is what I see happening. But this is a tendency that has been going on for a few hundred years, because there isn't a village. We need that. We need the connection, the community, and there isn't a core spiritual idea of the society. And as a result, we're all going insane. And I teach people how to cope with that and manage that and deal with that and create micro communities and find meaning personally. But that's the wider situation.
Mark, all right, here's the question. Do you think it's been done on purpose?
Well, it depends how conspiratorial we are.
I am very conspiratorial. Let's go.
Are there shadowy guys in a room making it? So the incentives are there. So some of it is simply economic incentives. So there's an economic incentive to move workforces around, for example. There's an economic incentive to push women into the workplace, even if they don't want to be there. And again, if they want to be there, great, but a lot don't when I speak to them. A lot of them would rather be home with their kids. So there's economic incentives at work, and I think that explains a lot of it. And I think the other one is more this historical, deep philosophical kind of view of history, which explains a lot of it. And even with those two things, yes, there may still be people in a room somewhere who are, what I think's tricky about conspiracies is governments aren't very efficient if you've ever seen them operate. So the idea that they're sort of operating super efficiently behind the scenes, I'm skeptical of.
Yeah. Well, I agree with that. But the people who can influence the government want it just like that. It's very, very easy if you had lots of money and lots of influence to get the way things. We just have to look back what happened in the last 4 years. If you look at that, how suddenly every government in the world was on board with this, with what happened.
Very strange. I was traveling around, and very strange. All the rules are exactly the same in all these different countries. I think even my mum got suspicious after COVID. My mum was just a normal person watching TV. She started saying, "This is bullshit. They're lying to us." I was like, "I've been saying it for years, Mum." And I think the trust is gone. We know the mainstream media is lying at this point because the internet's broken it. There's too many people like me and you with podcasts telling the truth, and now the mainstream media don't get away with it anymore. The internet has been a big problem for them.
It is very funny when you think about it, that the influence that some individual people, I mean, not me, you probably.
Well, I've had 3 million downloads on the podcast, right? So there's a lot of people.
There you go. Yeah. That's interesting. That's very interesting. That, and then we have to. Well, I don't really watch the news anymore. I've got different sources to get you get the better information elsewhere.
Of course. Why would you watch their news? It's bought and paid for. There's corporate interests.
And I hear people saying that particular journalist, I like that journalist. I like what they say. And I just say that's what they're saying, that because they get paid to say it and they get paid well.
Of course.
And that's the only reason. They're pure propaganda. And people, I get in arguments with people about this. Well, I used to. I'm much better now.
Moving into the podcast space now. There's major podcasts that I know I bought and paid for. I know for a fact because I know the people involved.
Ooh.
So there are podcasts out there, the people that look independent. Anything that you see that's super well produced, it's bought and paid for. Just if there's a few exceptions, people like Rogan who got in there early, but the vast majority now is the mainstream media is extending into the podcast and the YouTube space.
Well, it's too influential. Can you name names?
No,
you don't have to. Okay, so good production values.
I'd just say be very suspicious if you see very, very good production values. It's not in my best interest to call these guys out.
No, I understand. But it's funny. It is pretty fascinating. I mean, like I said to you before, for me, this is a hobby. If I can make a living at it, then, if I will sell out to anyone who wants to come in and pay.
Sponsored by Mr. Kindness VPN.
Sponsored by Bill Gates. No, I genuinely, if I could, this could be my main job, then of course I would. It's a lot of fun.
That's
I really
great. I love
enjoy it.
Podcasting. Get to speak to cool people, talk shit, ask interesting questions. I love it. Get best free. I've done 600 plus episodes. It's the best education I've ever had. It cost me about $50 to make an episode, so I'm like, that's well worth it.
Yeah, it's actually it's a lot cheaper than people might think.
Oh yeah,
you
take Libsyn and a little bit of other stuff. I have a cheap editor who just tops and tails them. I mean, if you want to be slick, it costs a lot of money. Podcast studios and stuff like that, but otherwise you can do it pretty cheap.
So you reckon? Okay, so I guess it's the ones who get pushed hard. The podcasts
if
are
the algorithm
pushed hard.
is pushing you, chances are someone who owns YouTube, which is Google, wants that to be mainstream.
Yeah, that's interesting and quite disheartening.
I mean, it's not the only way. There are things that sneak through. Like, I wouldn't be too cynical. But what I would say is the algorithm controls the world now, right? And the algorithm is written by someone. I have a friend at Google, right? And I messaged him. I said, "Hey, Tom, let's call him Tom because that's his actual name." I said, "Hey Tom, do you remember when you used to show us what we wanted to see and not what you wanted us to see?" And we both laughed. And it was like, you can't convince me at this point. And I've seen things just disappear out of Google and YouTube and all the major platforms.
Yeah.
So,
well, I actually have a guy I was in. Not going to say how I know him, but I know him. He's a friend who became very senior at Google. I won't mention the country either. I'm sure you could probably figure it out. Yeah, it's very interesting. It's very, very interesting when you see the whole thing. But that when there's a trend such now, I jumped on the bandwagon, you could say, but when you see a trend like that happening, and it's for a reason, because I think people are thirsting they really want to know what's going on. I think, as you said, people have lost all faith in most people, certainly younger people.
Across the board, I think people are really skeptical of politicians. They're really skeptical of media. Like all the universities have lost a lot of trust. I wouldn't send my kids to university now. There's no way.
No.
Unless they want to do dentistry or something specific. There's no way. All the institutions have lost trust because we understand they're not run for our interests.
No.
And they've also gone crazy. Like the sort of the cathedral, as it's sometimes called, which is the media plus universities, right? This is the sort of, there's a philosopher who calls it the cathedral, have gone more and more insane over the last 10, 20 years. And I think at this point, even normal people are just, you don't have to be a podcast conspiracy. Normal people are going, seriously? This is nonsense. And I think the trans thing really pushed it, and now everybody's just going, this is nonsense. People have it's been pushed too far.
Yeah, who designed that flag, and how come the flags are so well designed, and then suddenly they change, and then it's a new thing? I say I sometimes it's not arguments. It's just I'm pointing out some things. The younger friends of mine about, let's say for instance, trans, and I say I don't trust it because I've seen it happening in the last 10 years, and it came from nowhere, and then suddenly it's a thing, and they've got a flag, and they've got all the backing, and they're getting all the media, and that's what I call propaganda. And yeah, I'm probably he's some old white guy, I'm the demonized class now. I'm a what do you call it, a minority, and that's when you start to see how good the brainwashing actually is.
Oh, it's
people
every advert on the TV.
Yeah, it's insane, isn't it?
It's there, and the entire sort of media industry. Hollywood's crap now because it's pushing propaganda and not actually entertainment 9 times out of 10. Like, when was the last time you saw a Hollywood film that you thought that was fantastic? About 1 or 2 will come out a year. The rest, I'm just like, this is just weird propaganda. It's trying to push this weird worldview that, frankly, is bizarre.
And no one. Doesn't reflect reality.
Doesn't reflect reality at all. It really doesn't. And I think people have cottoned on to that and, realizing they're being lied to. So we don't have to get the tinfoil hats out too much now. I think that's pretty commonly thought, I think.
I saw a good meme the other day. You like this? You've probably seen it as well. But it's my tinfoil hat was more use than your mask.
Well, the problem is every conspiracy, half of them prove to be true within a few years, don't they? So at this point, I'm questioning everything, but it's very confusing. It's like, where's the line? Had a job candidate that applied for a job the other day, and he believes in flat Earth, and I'm thinking, God, that's a bit far. There's this. Where's your personal line in terms of conspiracy? Because it's thinking there's no conspiracy is as silly as thinking everything's a conspiracy, right? Like both of those positions are a little bit silly. Yeah.
The flat Earth thing is a funny one. I'm not going to say, I have looked into it. I will look into all these things, and I will.
I've got time. I've got time to look into everything. Well, I'm running a company. I'm training coaches. I'm supervising a charity in Ukraine. I haven't got time to look up at the lizard people conspiracy. Are they really the royal family? I don't.
So, yeah, but you can fall down a rabbit hole. I can see how people do fall down the flat Earth rabbit hole.
With the internet, it's really possible. And this is the problem when we've got no institutions we trust. We either have to do everything ourselves, or we get convinced by other people who may be bad actors in a different way. So there's no easy solutions here.
All right, so let's maybe go back to what we were supposed to talk about.
Right, what are we actually going to be talking about? I've got 10 minutes. Lizard
you
just
people
skiing down the slopes of Verbier. Let's get it out.
Because you just mentioned it there. is that obviously you've found your passion, you've got your direction in life, and this is what you want to do, and you're having a good time. You're clearly having a good time doing it. How many coaches have you trained?
God, thousands. I mean, I train a
Really?
few hundred a year in our main online course. We have something called Certificate of Embodiment Coaching. We train online coaches in person. Obviously, a lot less just because of the cohort sizes and things. So yeah, it's been my main job for a few years now, and I don't think it's the most meaningful thing in the world, but it has some meaning to me, and I certainly think more embodiment coaches in the world, they do seem to do some good and have some positive impact, and they all work in different ways. So they don't have to believe in all my conspiracies or politics or anything else. It's just a very practical set of tools. But I notice when people start connecting to the body, like good things happen. That's what I'd say. Like it's a
Yeah.
reality anchor, just to link it to what we just talked about.
Get back into it. Yeah.
Yeah.
So if ideal world, what would you be doing?
Ideal worlds don't exist, and people that dream them up end up genocidal. So I would never go anywhere near the concept of an ideal world. I'm a conservative. I believe in a non-ideal world. So actually, to be honest, I'm pretty close to my dream job. I probably do a bit more marketing than I would enjoy. I enjoy the podcast. I enjoy making YouTube videos. I don't enjoy the marketing meeting I had at 10 a.m. about the emails that we send out, but that's just life. Like sometimes you've got to wash your balls and do the washing up and, this stuff that chores that need doing, right? So, but honestly, I feel like every day is a bit of it's a gift, isn't it? It's a touch. Every day I wake up and I'm an embodiment teacher. My granddad was a fisherman in the Irish Sea. Like he was in submarines in World War II. Like this is like you're having a laugh. I'm just upset that they haven't got oat milk for my decaf cappuccino. It's like every day you don't just wake up and praise the gods that you're born in the modern era is a day you should read more history.
Yeah. Well, we could finish on this, right? Because I had the very similar realization lately, which was along the lines of give yourself a shake, Nicol, because how bad have you got it? And it's not like I realize I'm grateful that I have a good life, right? But I think I could be grateful being pretty much anywhere as long as I had a river you can sit by or some woods or something you can do to just literally ground yourself, take off your socks and shoes and walk around. And it was, because you get looped into things and you get upset by, things in the family or things at work or something like that, which puts you in a doom loop. And then I was telling my son about my great-grandfather, so his great-great-grandfather, who was in the trenches in World War I.
Yes, I've got friends in trenches now in Ukraine. It's rubbish.
Yeah, trenches in World War I in northern France. And then he was a policeman during the Blitz in World War II, and when they were bombing. I mean, I'm not sure how much bombs were dropped, but they were. But they were, air raid sirens going off, and definitely things going on. And all that's him, and he was a regular dude. Didn't seem like a good guy, but imagine the horrors that guy's seen. Depression. So you're talking extreme poverty as well for pretty much everyone, and we don't realize quite how good we have it, and that was for me was a good anchor back to reality. That sometimes it isn't as bad as we think it is.
It's interesting because we have to hold simultaneously two things. We live in the most materialistically successful culture that's ever lived, and in terms of possibilities, the fact that I've reached millions of people on the internet, the fact that if it was 1,000 people, it's a lot. The fact that we have all these possibilities, we can learn anything on YouTube. I can learn any language. I can date a hot Italian instead of being forced to date my cousin in the village. Like this, you married a hot Swedish woman, like life's good, And on the other hand, we also live in the most psychologically and spiritually bankrupt culture there ever has been. We are in the Great Depression of spirituality and emotional self-regulation right now. So we simultaneously have to go, we live in this impoverished era and this area where we're all, we're living like kings. My lunch was the equivalent of a king's 200 years ago. So it's like, can we simultaneously hold these things? That's probably the best view of reality we can have.
Yeah. It's so interesting though. Mark, listen, that's, I know you're a very busy man, so I'm going to let you let you go. Do you want to just say your socials, where people can find you, how they can maybe get hold of you and start one of your courses if they're inspired enough?
Yeah, I'm not on Tinder anymore, and I'm not on Grindr
That's
ever.
good.
So the best place to go is the internet.
Probably good.
Yeah, embodimentunlimited.com. So embodimentunlimited.com. They can find our coach trainifications. They can find a copy of my book on embodiment for free. And then I'm on all the normal socials like the Instagram, the YouTube, etc. So embodimentunlimited.com.
And thank you very much for reaching out to me. What an honor.
No, it was a pleasure, man. Good conversation. Really interesting. Bit different. So, yeah.
Yeah, I went a bit kind of off piece, but I really appreciate it. Mark, thank you so much, Mark Walsh. And thanks for listening. Take care. Bye-bye.